Stepmother forces millionaire's daughter to marry a homeless man to teach her a lesson. But on the wedding day, the groom reveals a shocking secret that changes everything. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets of San Francisco, its golden rays spilling between the towering buildings and dancing on the cracked sidewalk. Jake sat hunched in a quiet corner of Market Street, his back pressed against the cold concrete of a department store wall. His hands, weathered and rough, were tucked into his jacket pockets, but the threadbare fabric offered little warmth. His eyes, once sharp and bright, now dulled by exhaustion, scanned the crowd passing by without truly seeing them. Just another day, another endless parade of strangers who refused to look his way. The growl in his stomach had become a constant companion, a reminder of the days stretching behind him, each one blurred into the next without enough food to fill the void. He shifted uncomfortably, his muscles aching from sleeping on hard ground for too long. Pride kept him from begging directly, he didn't have it in him to ask for what no one seemed willing to give. He sighed deeply and lowered his head, already resigned to another day of being invisible. Then, from the corner of his eye, Jake saw a pair of worn sneakers stop in front of him. He didn't look up right away, assuming they'd move on like everyone else. But the shoes stayed planted, unmoving, almost hesitant. After a beat, a soft, female voice broke the silence around him. "Are you hungry?" Jake blinked and raised his head, his gaze meeting the concerned eyes of a young woman. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with warm brown hair pulled into a low ponytail, and her features soft yet serious, as if she had made a decision she wasn't entirely sure about. She held a brown paper bag in her hand, the smell of warm bread and roasted chicken seeping from the small opening. Jake tensed. His instinct was to say no, to keep his pride intact, but the gnawing in his stomach overpowered his stubbornness. He looked at her again, properly this time, searching for any hint of pity in her eyes. To his surprise, he found none. There was no judgment, only an unexpected kindness that caught him off guard. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice rough, throat dry from days of too little water and too much silence. The woman didn't budge. She crouched down, leveling her gaze with his. "Look, I won't push. But if you're hungry, I have extra." She held the bag a little closer, offering it with the same determination she had when she'd first spoken. Jake hesitated, his pride wrestling with his hunger. Eventually, the hunger won. He reached out slowly, wrapping his fingers around the bag. The warmth seeped through the paper, and the simple sensation of holding something fresh, something that hadn't been picked from a trash bin, almost brought tears to his eyes. He blinked them away, nodding a small thanks. He couldn't trust his voice to say anything more. She smiled, but it was a small, quiet one. "I'm Emma," she said simply. "Jake," he replied after a moment, his voice hoarse. There was an awkward pause. Emma seemed to be waiting for something, but Jake wasn't used to small talk with strangers, especially ones like her. She didn't belong here, in this corner of his world. She had no business kneeling on a dirty sidewalk, talking to someone who barely existed in the eyes of others. "You don't have to stay," Jake said gruffly, lowering his eyes to the ground again, embarrassed by how much her presence made him feel exposed. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but a sharp voice from behind her cut through the fragile moment. "Emma, what are you doing?" The words were laced with disapproval. Jake's head snapped up, his body instinctively stiffening at the sound. Standing a few feet away was a woman who looked like she'd stepped straight out of a glossy magazine. Blonde hair pulled back in an immaculate bun, a designer coat draped over her shoulders, and a scowl that could freeze anyone in their tracks. Her heels clicked with authority as she approached, her eyes flicking to Jake only briefly, as though she were looking at something unpleasant on the bottom of her shoe. Emma stood quickly, looking guilty, though she tried to mask it. "Carla, I was just..." I know exactly what you were doing, Carla snapped, her tone clipped and cold. She gave Jake another glance, her lip curling slightly. Honestly, Emma, how many times do I have to tell you not to waste your time on this? She gestured vaguely at Jake, as if he were just part of the street trash that littered the city. It's not good for your image, or our families. Emma bristled, her shoulders straightening. It's not about an image, Carla. It's about helping someone who needs it. Carla's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. We don't have time for this. We're going to be late. Get in the car. Jake watched the interaction, his stomach turning, but not from hunger. He hated that someone as kind as Emma was being scolded for doing something decent. He glanced down at the bag in his hands, feeling the weight of it, feeling undeserving of her generosity in the face of her stepmother's contempt. Emma hesitated for just a moment longer before turning back to Jake. She gave him a small, apologetic smile, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet defiance that told him this wouldn't be the last time she chose to stand her ground. Take care, Jake, she said softly, before turning and walking toward Carla, whose heels were already clicking impatiently toward a black town car parked nearby. Jake watched them go, feeling an odd mixture of gratitude and something heavier, a sense that this brief encounter had shaken the walls around him in a way he couldn't quite understand. He clutched the bag tighter, the smell of fresh food filling his senses. As the car door slammed and the engine hummed to life, Jake stared at the retreating vehicle, wondering if he'd ever see that woman again. Carla's hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel as the black town car glided smoothly through the streets of San Francisco. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, remained fixed on the road ahead, but her mind was spinning. The sight of that man, Jake, as Emma had called him, had sent a shiver of recognition down her spine. It had been years since she'd seen those eyes, but she could never forget them. They were too familiar, too connected to a part of her past she had fought so hard to bury. She forced herself to breathe steadily, keeping her expression neutral. Next to her, Emma sat in stony silence, arms crossed tightly across her chest, staring out the window. Carla didn't bother engaging her in conversation. Emma was always so infuriatingly stubborn, so determined to resist her guidance. She didn't understand the stakes, didn't see the bigger picture. But Carla did. As the car turned onto a quiet, upscale street, her thoughts drifted back to the early days of her marriage to Emma's father, Gregory. He was an influential man, respected in both business and social circles, and Carla had been careful to present herself as the perfect, devoted wife. Her path to wealth and status had been swift, but not without its complications. Her first husband, Jonathan, had left her more than just bitter memories, he'd left her with a loose end. Jake. Or as he had been known back then, Nathaniel. The boy had been barely 7 when Jonathan died, and while Carla had managed to mask her involvement in his sudden demise, the child had posed a different problem. He was Jonathan's son, the legitimate heir to the Radcliffe fortune, and though Jonathan had left no will, everyone knew the boy would inherit everything. Carla couldn't afford to let that happen. Her climb to the top was too precarious. She needed control, needed power, and a child would only get in the way. So, she did what she had to. She had carefully orchestrated the boy's disappearance, making it look like a tragic accident. No one asked too many questions. With Jonathan gone, no one cared enough about a missing child to dig too deeply. People in their social circle had their own scandals to cover up. Carla had played her cards well, and the world had forgotten about the Radcliffe heir, everyone but her. And now, after all these years, here he was. Sitting on the streets like a ghost from her past. Carla's lips pressed into a thin line as she turned the car into the driveway of their mansion. She parked, but for a moment, she didn't move. Her mind raced, formulating a plan. She had built everything on her control of the Radcliffe estate. If Jake, Nathaniel, ever learned the truth, her empire would collapse. There was too much at risk, and she wouldn't allow some homeless drifter to undo all her work. She glanced at Emma from the corner of her eye. The girl had always been too soft, too idealistic. Emma's mother had died when she was young, leaving Gregory to raise her. Carla had never been able to fully tame her, no matter how hard she tried. And now, Emma's foolish compassion for that man could ruin everything. A plan began to take shape in Carla's mind, a plan that would solve two problems at once. She'd humiliate Emma, force her into a marriage with this homeless man, and in doing so, protect her secret. If Nathaniel was tied to Emma in the public eye, his identity would remain buried beneath the shame of his new life. He'd never question where he came from, never suspect the truth. It was perfect. Carla opened the door and stepped out of the car, her heels clicking sharply on the stone driveway. Emma followed slowly, still brooding over their earlier confrontation. Carla said nothing as they entered the mansion, her thoughts too focused on the steps ahead. She needed to move quickly. Once inside, Carla headed straight for her office, the familiar scent of leather and polished wood calming her nerves. She shut the door behind her and walked over to her desk, her fingers grazing the top of a silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of her and Jonathan, smiling for the camera in their early days of marriage. Back when she had been playing the perfect wife. Back before everything had fallen apart. She pushed the frame face down, turning her attention to the sleek laptop in front of her. With a few quick clicks, she pulled up a list of lawyers she had on retainer. There was one who specialized in these kinds of discreet matters, legal arrangements that wouldn't attract too much attention but would bind people in ways they couldn't easily escape. A marriage contract would be drawn up quickly, one that left Jake with no real power, but enough financial incentive to keep him quiet. She'd present the offer to him soon, make it seem like his only way out of the streets. Carla knew desperation, and she knew he wouldn't refuse. And Emma, well, Emma would have to go along with it. There was too much on the line. Carla would make her see that. Her eyes flicked toward the window, where the city skyline shimmered in the distance. She had built this life brick by brick, with careful precision and ruthless determination. No one, especially not some forgotten child from her past, was going to take that from her. The knock on the door startled her. "Come in," she called, her voice steady and composed. Emma stepped into the office, her arms still crossed, her expression a mix of defiance and confusion. "What are you planning, Carla? I know that look on your face. I know you too well." Carla stood, smoothing her blouse as she walked toward Emma, her lips curving into a practiced smile. "My dear, I'm simply looking out for your future. You want to help that man, don't you? What better way than to give him a chance at a real life, with you by his side?" Emma's eyes narrowed. "A chance at life? You're talking about humiliating him." "Humiliating me?" Carla waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense. Think of it as an opportunity. For him and for you. You can save him from a life on the streets. Isn't that what you wanted?" Emma's voice trembled with frustration. "You're doing this to hurt me. And I don't understand why." Carla's eyes darkened, the smile slipping from her face. "You don't need to understand. You just need to do as you're told." Emma stared at her, stunned into silence. Carla's smile returned, colder now. "The arrangements will be made by tomorrow. I suggest you prepare yourself." And with that, Carla turned and walked back to her desk, dismissing Emma without another word. The wind was sharper today, biting at the edges of Jake's worn jacket as he walked the familiar streets of San Francisco. It had only been a day since that brief encounter with Emma, but the memory of it lingered. People usually didn't see him, at least, not beyond the dirty clothes and tired eyes. Yet, she had. That simple act of kindness had felt more significant than he was willing to admit. He didn't expect to see her again, not in this city where people came and went, always in a hurry, always looking through him as if he were invisible. But as he rounded the corner of a quiet alley, there she was, her stepmother, Carla. Standing against the sleek lines of a black luxury car, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him with a mix of disdain and something darker, something calculating. Jake stopped in his tracks, instantly wary. Carla was the kind of woman who had everything: power, money, influence, and yet, she seemed dangerous. There was something unsettling about the way she held herself, like she could cut you down with a single word. She didn't wait for him to come closer. Instead, she moved toward him, her heels tapping against the pavement like the ticking of a clock. "You're Jake, right?" Her voice was clipped, businesslike. He straightened his back, his instincts telling him to walk away, but curiosity held him there. "Yeah, that's me. I don't have time for small talk, so I'll get straight to the point." Carla stopped just short of standing too close, her eyes scanning him up and down. "I have a proposition for you." Jake raised an eyebrow, folding his arms. "A proposition? I don't think I'm your kind of guy." Carla smirked, but it wasn't a smile, it was the look of someone who knew they held all the cards. "I want you to marry my stepdaughter, Emma." Jake blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. "You want me to what?" "You heard me." She shifted her weight, clearly impatient. "Marry her. It doesn't have to be real in the emotional sense. Just a contract. A marriage of convenience, for both of you." Jake felt like the world had tilted sideways. He stared at her, trying to understand why someone like Carla would offer something so bizarre, especially to a homeless man. "Why me?" Carla's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing. "Because you're useful. And because you're nobody. Marrying you will teach Emma a lesson she desperately needs to learn. She's too soft, too naive. This will bring her back to reality." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, the sting of her words hitting harder than they should. He had lived long enough on the streets to know what people like her thought of him, but hearing it so plainly still stung. "And what do I get out of this little arrangement?" he asked, his voice tighter than he meant it to be. Carla's expression didn't change, but her tone softened, a false sweetness laced with venom. "Money, of course. More than you'll ever need. Enough to get you off the streets, to start a new life. You could even help the people you care so much about. I've seen how you are with the others. The people you share your food with. You could finally make a real difference." Jake's heart thudded in his chest. That was the hook, the one thing she could say that might actually make him consider this insanity. He had lived this life for too long, seen too much suffering. People like him didn't get chances like this. And the thought of being able to help, to actually change something, was tempting. But there was a price. He knew that. There was always a price. Jake studied Carla's face, searching for cracks, for any sign that she wasn't as in control as she wanted him to believe. But her mask didn't slip. She had him cornered, and she knew it. "And what about Emma?" he asked finally. "What does she think of all this?" Carla's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Emma doesn't know yet. And she doesn't need to. You'll play your part, I'll handle the rest. Once the marriage is done, we all move on." Jake's stomach twisted. He didn't like the idea of deceiving Emma, not after what she'd done for him, however small it had seemed at the time. She wasn't like Carla, that much was clear. But Carla was dangling the kind of opportunity that people in his position didn't get. He could leave this life behind. He could help the people who'd been left behind with him. And wasn't that worth something? "I don't know," Jake said, his voice low. "This doesn't sit right with me." Carla stepped closer, her voice dropping to a smooth, persuasive tone. "Think about it, Jake. What are your other options? You can stay out here, living like this, scraping by. Or you can do this one thing. One simple thing. And you'll never have to worry about where your next meal comes from again. You could help your friends, give them a better life. Isn't that what you want?" Jake swallowed hard, his thoughts churning. She was right. What were his other options? He had none. Not really. This was the kind of deal you didn't walk away from, no matter how much it felt wrong in your gut. He looked down at his shoes, scuffed and frayed, the worn-out laces barely holding together. This wasn't the life he wanted, but it was the life he'd been stuck in. And now there was a way out. "All right," he said quietly, meeting Carla's gaze. "I'll do it. But I want to know what happens after." Carla's smirk returned, satisfied. "After? You'll get your money, and you'll disappear. The marriage will stay on paper, nothing more. Emma won't be any wiser, and neither will anyone else." Jake nodded, though the weight of the decision sat heavy on his shoulders. He knew he was making a deal with the devil, but the chance to change his life, and the lives of others, was too hard to ignore. "Good." Carla's voice was sharp, businesslike once again. "I'll be in touch with the details. Don't screw this up." She turned on her heel and strode back to the car without another glance, leaving Jake standing alone in the cold, the weight of her proposal settling over him like a storm cloud. Emma paced the length of her bedroom, her heart hammering in her chest. The walls of the room, usually her refuge, felt like they were closing in. Carla had just dropped the bombshell, an arranged marriage. And not just with anyone. With Jake. The man she'd barely met, a man from the streets. A man who, for some reason, her stepmother wanted to use like a pawn in whatever twisted game she was playing. She stopped at the window, gripping the edge of the sill, trying to steady herself. San Francisco's glittering skyline spread out before her, the city bustling with life, unaware of the storm brewing in her own life. Emma couldn't make sense of it. Why Jake? Why any of this? She knew Carla had been angry with her for years, ever since Emma had insisted on using her own inheritance for charity work, funneling money into causes Carla deemed beneath them. It wasn't the first time Carla had criticized her choices, but this was something else entirely. There was a knock on the door. Emma knew who it was before she even turned around. "Come in," she said, her voice sharper than usual. Carla stepped in, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor, her expression calm and unbothered, as though she hadn't just upended Emma's entire world. "You're angry," Carla observed, her voice as smooth as silk. "Angry?" Emma whipped around to face her, the disbelief in her voice unmistakable. "You think I'm just angry? You're trying to marry me off to a man I don't even know, a homeless man, without even asking me. What is wrong with you?" Carla didn't flinch. Instead, she walked toward the plush chair by the bed and sat down, crossing her legs gracefully. "What's wrong, Emma, is that you refuse to see reality. You're always out there, throwing money and sympathy at people like him. But you don't understand them. You don't understand the consequences of associating with people who have nothing to lose." Emma shook her head, struggling to keep her composure. "This isn't about them, this is about you. You've hated everything I've done, every decision I've made since Mom died. And now, you're punishing me by forcing me into a marriage with someone you think is beneath us." Carla's eyes flickered for just a moment, but then her expression hardened again. "I'm not punishing you, Emma. I'm teaching you a lesson. You're naive. You think you can save the world, but you're only putting yourself at risk. This marriage will show you that people like Jake aren't to be trusted. That they'll take advantage of your kindness the first chance they get." Emma's stomach churned at the coldness in Carla's words. "And you think marrying him will prove that?" "Yes," Carla said simply. "You'll see soon enough. This will bring you back to the world you belong in, our world. The one where you understand that people have their place, and that not everyone is worth saving." Emma felt a wave of nausea at Carla's words. The idea of forcing Jake into this situation, of using him as part of some sick lesson, made her skin crawl. She wasn't just horrified for herself, she was horrified for him. I won't do it, Emma said, her voice shaking with both fear and determination. You can't force me. Carla's lips curled into a small smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I can. And I will. She rose from the chair, walking slowly toward Emma, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You see, Emma, your father's business isn't doing as well as you think. He's made some risky investments that are barely holding up. It wouldn't take much to tip the scales and ruin everything he's worked for. Emma's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that one wrong move, one bad press story about his daughter marrying a homeless man, or your refusal to go through with this marriage, and everything collapses. Carla's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The company would go under. Your father would lose everything. Including his reputation. Emma took a step back, the weight of Carla's threat sinking in. She had known her father's company had struggled in the past, but she hadn't realized how fragile things really were. And Carla knew it. She had known all along. So that's what this is? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You're threatening to ruin my father if I don't marry Jake? Carla's smile didn't falter. I'm giving you a choice, Emma. You can go through with the wedding and protect your family's name and fortune. Or you can walk away and watch everything crumble around you. It's up to you. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. She had spent her entire life trying to do good, trying to live up to the ideals her mother had instilled in her. And now, Carla was using her love for her family against her, trapping her in a decision she never should have to make. She turned back to the window, staring out at the city she loved, the life she had worked so hard to build. It felt like it was all slipping away from her, out of her control. No matter what she chose, someone would get hurt. Either Jake would be pulled into Carla's twisted game, or her father's business would fall apart. Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She had always believed in doing the right thing, but now the right thing seemed impossible to find. How could she sacrifice herself, and Jake, just to keep her father's company afloat? But how could she watch her father lose everything? The silence in the room grew heavier, thicker, as Carla waited for her answer. Emma knew what she had to do, but it felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in. I'll do it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Carla's smile widened, satisfied. I knew you'd make the right choice. Emma felt a coldness settle over her, a deep, aching sadness that wouldn't go away. She had been forced into a corner, manipulated by the very person who was supposed to care for her, and now she was bound to a decision she could never have imagined making. The mansion was a far cry from the streets. It was all marble floors, high ceilings, and the kind of silence that unnerved Jake. He stood awkwardly in the foyer, still adjusting to the tailored suit that Carla had demanded he wear. The fabric was soft, unfamiliar against his skin. It fit perfectly, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't meant for him. None of this was. A maid had shown him to the guest room upstairs, if you could even call it a guest room. It was larger than any apartment he'd ever lived in, with a four-poster bed draped in heavy fabrics, and antique furniture that gleamed in the soft light. It should have felt luxurious, but instead, it felt stifling. Claustrophobic. Jake wandered the halls of the mansion while he waited, restless and on edge. He knew this wasn't just a matter of waiting for a wedding. Something else lingered in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. His gaze swept over the paintings that lined the walls, rich portraits of generations of well-to-do men and women, all of them dressed in finery that screamed old money. As he walked past one in particular, his feet stopped moving. It wasn't like he had planned to stop. Something about the portrait grabbed him and held him in place, like gravity had shifted and pulled him toward it. It was a man. Middle-aged, with dark, brooding eyes and a stern expression. He wore a sharp suit, standing with his hand resting on the arm of a chair, like a king surveying his domain. Jake felt a strange tightening in his chest as he looked into the man's eyes. Something stirred, something he couldn't quite grasp. He stepped closer, squinting at the small plaque at the bottom of the frame, Jonathan Radcliffe, 1994. The name meant nothing to him. But the face, there was something there. Some distant echo in the back of his mind, like a dream that wouldn't fully come into focus. His head started to ache as he strained to remember, to pull at the thread of familiarity that hovered just beyond reach. Memories flashed like shards of broken glass, disconnected and blurry. He could see the silhouette of a woman, a soft voice that was warm and comforting. A child's laughter. And then, just as quickly, those memories twisted into something darker. The woman's voice was frantic now, hurried, and the child's laughter had turned into cries. He felt her hand on his back, pushing him forward, urging him to go somewhere, to hide. Jake stumbled back from the painting, his breath coming faster. He pressed a hand to his forehead, his pulse racing as the fragmented images danced through his mind. He hadn't thought about his childhood in years. He couldn't. It was like that part of his life had been locked away, sealed shut. But now, standing here in this mansion, pieces of it were starting to leak through the cracks. Who was the woman? His mother? Why couldn't he remember her face? Shaking off the dizziness, Jake turned away from the portrait, trying to push the images back into the box they had come from. But they wouldn't stay buried. As he walked farther down the hall, more flashes came, this time, a garden, the smell of fresh grass, and the sound of footsteps crunching against gravel. He saw himself as a small boy, running through the yard, the same woman calling after him. Jake's hands clenched into fists. These weren't just dreams. These were memories. Memories of a life he'd long forgotten, a life that seemed so far removed from the one he lived now. It didn't make sense. He felt the weight of Carla's words from their earlier conversation pressing down on him. She had spoken with such disdain, such condescension, as if she had some personal vendetta against him. And the more he thought about it, the more it unsettled him. Why did she care? Why go to such lengths to manipulate him and Emma into this farce of a marriage? The air in the mansion felt heavier now, thick with unspoken truths. As Jake reached the grand staircase, he paused again, his gaze drawn to another piece of artwork. This one was smaller, less formal. A family portrait, with a younger version of the man from the earlier painting. Jonathan Radcliffe, but with a woman beside him, elegant, with dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, and a small boy sitting on the man's lap. Jake's breath hitched in his throat. The boy's face was familiar. Too familiar. It was him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He took a step closer, studying the child's features, his features. He remembered now. He remembered sitting in that man's lap, remembered the warmth of the fire crackling in the background, remembered feeling safe. But it didn't last. He remembered other things, too, how the woman, his mother, had suddenly disappeared one night, leaving him behind. He remembered being taken away, his father's house sold off, his childhood erased. Carla. It all came back in a rush, like a dam breaking. Carla had married his father after his mother was gone. She had been young then, beautiful, but cold. She had never cared for him. And after his father died, she had sent him away. Just like that, he had become another lost child, forgotten in the shuffle of foster homes and broken systems. Jake backed away from the painting, his mind reeling. Carla had to know. She had to know who he was, who he had been. And yet, she had acted like he was nothing more than a stray dog she could use for her schemes. She had taken everything from him, his family, his childhood, his identity. His hand shook as he wiped a hand over his face, trying to steady himself. He had to confront her. He had to know the truth. But now, more than ever, he realized that Carla wasn't just trying to humiliate Emma. She was trying to bury her past. And somehow, he had stumbled right into the middle of it. Jake turned on his heel, heading back down the hall with renewed purpose. He wasn't going to let her win this time. He had been lost for years, but he wasn't lost anymore. He had found something, and this time, he wasn't letting it go. As he walked past the portrait of Jonathan Radcliffe one last time, Jake straightened his shoulders. He was done being a pawn in Carla's twisted game. The mansion buzzed with the hum of activity as wedding preparations moved forward with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Florists hurried in and out, their arms overflowing with delicate arrangements of lilies and roses. The dining staff meticulously set the tables in the grand ballroom, each place setting gleaming under the chandelier's glow. Outside, a white tent had been erected, stretching across the lush green lawn where the ceremony would take place. High society was coming, and everything had to be perfect. Perfect for everyone but Emma. She sat in front of her vanity, hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the reflection of her face in the mirror. It was pale, strained, and the elegant white dress she wore only made her look more like a ghost. The soft fabric clung to her body, as if trying to soothe her, but she felt no comfort from it. The wedding was happening. There was no turning back. She had tried to reason with Carla again that morning, pleading for some shred of understanding, but her stepmother's response had been the same cold indifference. Emma sighed, her thoughts interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She didn't need to ask who it was, there was only one person who would knock so tentatively. "Come in, Jake." He opened the door, stepping inside with a tension that matched hers. He, too, was dressed for the occasion. The dark suit he wore fit him well, but it couldn't mask the discomfort in his eyes. He looked as out of place in this mansion as she felt trapped in it. "We need to talk," Emma said, turning away from the mirror and facing him. Jake nodded, closing the door behind him. "I've been thinking the same thing." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation hung between them, heavy and oppressive. This was supposed to be their wedding day, but nothing about it felt real, and they both knew why. Emma stood, brushing her hand along the edge of the vanity as she moved toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. "I don't want this," she said finally, her voice soft, but filled with conviction. "I don't want any of this. Not like this." Jake's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something beyond his guarded exterior, a flicker of understanding, of shared frustration. "Neither do I," he admitted, his voice low. "But Carla, she's got us both cornered." Emma's jaw tightened. "Why did you agree to this? I thought you were better than someone who could be bought." The accusation stung, and Jake flinched, but he didn't look away. "You think I'm doing this for the money?" "Sure, the money helps, but not for the reasons you think." He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I agreed to this because of the people I left behind on the streets. The ones I couldn't help when I was out there. Carla's money, it's my one chance to do something good, to get them out of the mess they're in. I can't walk away from that." Emma blinked, her anger softening just a fraction. "You're trying to help them?" Jake nodded, his expression earnest. "That's all I've ever wanted. I don't care about fancy clothes or this mansion. I don't care about high society. But if I can use Carla's wealth to actually make a difference, then yeah, I'll put on a suit and play her game for a while." Emma studied him, the sincerity in his voice making her pause. She had spent the last few days feeling nothing but resentment toward him, convinced he was just another pawn in Carla's manipulation. But now, standing before her, Jake seemed different, more than just the man from the streets she had tried to help once. He had his own motivations, and they weren't so different from hers after all. "I had no idea," Emma murmured, her voice softening. "I thought you were just going along with her." Jake's lips twisted into a wry smile. "It's not like I have many options. But I'm not doing this because I want to. I'm doing it because I have to." She nodded slowly, feeling the tension between them shift. Maybe she had misjudged him. Maybe, just maybe, they could work together. What about you? Jake asked, his tone curious. Why are you going along with this? Emma looked down, her hands twisting together in her lap. My father's business. Carla threatened to ruin him if I didn't agree. He's worked his whole life for that company, and I couldn't stand the thought of watching it collapse because of me. Jake frowned, understanding dawning in his eyes. So she's got us both locked in, then. Yeah, Emma said bitterly. Seems that way. Silence fell between them once again, but this time it wasn't as sharp, not as angry. They were both trapped in the same web, both fighting against forces bigger than themselves. And yet, now that the truth was out in the open, Emma felt something shift. They weren't enemies. Not anymore. Jake was the first to break the silence. What if we find a way out? Together. Emma looked up, surprised. What do you mean? We go through with the wedding. We play Carla's game for now. But after that, we figure out how to turn the tables. There has to be a way to expose what she's doing, to make her pay for all of this. Emma's heart raced at the suggestion. She had spent so long feeling helpless, powerless against Carla's machinations, but now there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could fight back. Maybe they could win. Do you really think we can? She asked, her voice cautious but laced with a thread of excitement. Jake's eyes hardened with determination. I know we can. Carla thinks she's got it all under control, but we've got the advantage now. She doesn't know we're on to her. Emma felt a small smile tug at the corners of her lips. For the first time in days, she didn't feel completely lost. She had Jake, and together, they might just have a chance. Okay, she said, nodding firmly. Let's do it. We'll go through with the wedding, and then we'll find a way to take her down. Jake's smile mirrored hers. Deal. The mansion was silent as night fell, its grand halls emptied of the bustling staff and wedding preparations. Outside, the sky was a dark canvas dotted with stars, but inside, the air was heavy with tension. Jake lay on the bed in his guest room, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts churning restlessly. Sleep seemed like an impossible task with everything weighing on him. Tomorrow, he would be married. To Emma. Not out of love or choice, but out of a twisted arrangement that served only Carla's agenda. He had agreed to play along, but the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. Something about this entire situation still felt wrong on a level he couldn't quite explain. And it wasn't just the moral outrage of being used as a pawn in someone else's game. It was personal, like Carla's disdain for him went far deeper than mere manipulation. Jake shifted on the bed, closing his eyes in the hope that sleep might come, but as soon as he did, images began to flicker behind his eyelids, fragments of his past, broken and blurry, swirling in and out of focus. They had been coming more frequently ever since he stepped into this mansion, as if something about the place had unlocked a door he didn't even know existed. Tonight, though, the memories came faster, sharper. He was a child again, small, no more than 6 or 7, running through a sprawling garden. The scent of fresh earth and blooming roses filled the air. Laughter echoed around him, his own high-pitched giggles mingling with the soft voice of a woman. Come on, Nathaniel, she called, her voice warm and familiar. Nathaniel. The name hit Jake like a punch to the gut, but he couldn't stop the dream from pulling him deeper. The garden faded, replaced by the interior of a grand house, not unlike the one he was in now. The furniture was different, the colors warmer, but the same sense of wealth and privilege lingered in every corner. And there, standing in the doorway, was the woman from the garden. Dark hair. Gentle eyes. Her hand extended toward him. His mother. His breath hitched as he remembered the way she used to hold him, the way her smile could light up even the darkest rooms. But then the image shifted, her smile vanished, replaced by fear. She was speaking quickly now, her hand shaking as she guided him toward a hidden staircase at the back of the house. "You have to go, Nathaniel. You have to hide," she whispered, urgency lacing her words. "Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." The dream spun again, and this time, the face of another man loomed in the shadows. His father, stern and protective, standing tall in his tailored suit. There was shouting, an argument Jake couldn't quite make out. And then, just as quickly as the man appeared, he was gone. The scene blurred once more, and Jake found himself in a different part of the house, crouching in a small room, barely breathing. He could hear voices, two women. One of them was his mother, but the other voice, it was colder, harder. "Carla." Jake's pulse quickened as the memory surged. He could hear Carla's voice, sharp and cruel, whispering threats to his mother. The words were faint, but the meaning was clear. Carla wanted something his mother wouldn't give her. And when his mother refused, the whispers turned to violence. Suddenly, the dream shifted again, and Jake was older, standing in a hallway as Carla, younger but unmistakable, brushed past him with a sneer. She was dressed in black, her expression grim but triumphant, as if she had won something. And then he saw it, the casket in the living room, his father lying inside, cold and still. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. Carla had been there, in his life, all along. She wasn't just some manipulative stepmother, she was the woman who had taken everything from him. She had married his father, waited until the moment was right, and then orchestrated his death to seize the Radcliffe fortune. But that wasn't enough. She had sent Jake away, Nathaniel away, erasing him from the family entirely, ensuring that no one would ever challenge her control over the estate. Jake jolted awake, his chest heaving, sweat slicking his skin. His heart pounded in his ears, the echoes of the dream still swirling in his mind. It wasn't just a dream. It was his past. His real past. He sat up, his mind racing as the full weight of what he had remembered settled over him. Carla hadn't just manipulated him into this marriage for some petty power play, she had done it to keep him from reclaiming what was rightfully his. She had known who he was from the moment she saw him on the streets, and now, she was making sure he stayed buried. Nathaniel Radcliffe. That was his name. He wasn't Jake, the homeless man with no past. He was Nathaniel, the lost heir to the Radcliffe fortune, the son of Jonathan Radcliffe, and the rightful owner of everything Carla had stolen. The enormity of it all crashed over him, leaving him breathless. He had spent years scraping by, believing he was nothing, no one. And all the while, the truth had been hidden, just out of reach. Carla had known. She had known and she had destroyed his life. And now, she was forcing him into this sham of a marriage, to make sure he never realized who he was. But it was too late. He knew now. He knew everything. Jake, or Nathaniel, stood, his legs shaky, but his resolve hardening with each passing second. He couldn't let Carla win. Not this time. He had spent too long in the shadows, too long being controlled by forces he didn't understand. He wasn't that child anymore. He wasn't the boy hiding in the dark while his mother fought battles on his behalf. This time, he was ready to fight for himself. He paced the room, his mind racing. He needed to tell Emma, needed to let her know the truth about why Carla was so desperate to force them into this marriage. But he also needed to be smart. If Carla knew he had remembered everything, she would come at them harder, faster. She wouldn't hesitate to destroy them both to protect her position. Nathaniel clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as the plan began to form in his mind. He would go through with the wedding, but not for Carla. This was about reclaiming what was his identity, his inheritance, his life. And he wasn't going to let Carla take anything else from him. As he stared out the window, the moonlight casting long shadows over the mansion grounds, Nathaniel made a silent vow. Tomorrow, everything would change. The air in the grand ballroom was heavy with anticipation. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, casting soft light over the sea of well-dressed guests seated in rows of plush chairs. The scent of roses filled the room, their pale petals strewn along the aisle leading to the ornate altar at the front. Soft music played, creating the illusion of serenity, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. For Jake, no, Nathaniel, everything was about to change. He stood at the front of the room, his hands clenched at his sides, eyes scanning the faces of the people gathered. They were there to witness a spectacle, a society wedding that would solidify the Radcliffe name in the eyes of the elite. But they had no idea what was coming. Carla had orchestrated every detail, her mastery of deception seamless. Except for one thing, she hadn't counted on him remembering. His pulse raced, the truth burning inside him, ready to spill out. This was it. The moment when everything would finally be revealed. The years of lies, the manipulation, the theft of his life, it all led to this confrontation. The music changed, signaling the arrival of the bride. Emma appeared at the end of the aisle, draped in white satin, her face pale but composed. Their eyes met, and though they had planned this moment together, the enormity of it hit him all at once. He wasn't just about to expose Carla. He was about to change Emma's life, too. She began her slow walk down the aisle, each step measured and graceful. But even from a distance, Nathaniel could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had agreed to go through with the wedding, to help him expose the truth, but the weight of what they were about to do loomed large over both of them. Carla stood to the side, near the altar, her face a picture of satisfaction. She wore her usual expression of cold indifference, though a smile played at the corners of her mouth, as if she believed she had won. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. She had no idea. Emma reached the front, and they turned to face the officiant together, their movements rehearsed, their lines memorized. But just as the officiant began to speak, Nathaniel took a step forward, raising his hand. "Wait," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to silence the room. Heads turned, whispers rippling through the crowd like a gust of wind. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, but his focus remained fixed on one person. Carla. She blinked, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she didn't move. "What are you doing, Jake?" she asked, her voice low but sharp enough to carry across the room. Nathaniel turned to face her fully, his chest tight, his hands shaking with barely contained anger. "It's not Jake," he said, his voice ringing clear through the ballroom. "My name is Nathaniel Radcliffe." The silence that followed was absolute. He could feel the shock radiating from the guests, the confusion, the disbelief. But Carla's face remained impassive, though her eyes darkened with something close to panic. "Nathaniel Radcliffe?" someone whispered from the crowd. Nathaniel pressed on, his voice gaining strength with each word. "That's right. I'm the son of Jonathan Radcliffe, the rightful heir to this estate." The same heir that Carla, he turned to her, his voice hardening, had sent away. The same boy she abandoned after orchestrating my father's death. Carla's eyes flashed, her calm exterior cracking just slightly. She stepped forward, her voice laced with venom. "This is absurd. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're nothing but a homeless man, a nobody, who's trying to ruin this family for money." Nathaniel shook his head, his gaze locked on hers. "That's where you're wrong. I remember everything now. I remember how you came into my life after my mother disappeared. I remember the way you whispered lies to my father, the way you made sure no one questioned his sudden death." Gasps erupted from the guests, murmurs rising as people exchanged confused and scandalized glances. Emma stood beside him, frozen in place, her eyes wide as the truth unraveled around her. But Carla didn't back down. "You're delusional. This is some desperate attempt to con your way into a fortune that doesn't belong to you." Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Is it, Carla? Because I remember you making sure I was taken away after my father's funeral. I remember the way you sold off everything that belonged to my family, pocketing the profits for yourself. And when I was out on the streets, forgotten, you lived here in this mansion, pretending to be the widow of a man you killed. The silence was deafening. Carla's face twisted into a mask of fury, her control slipping as her world began to crumble around her. You have no proof, she hissed. No one will believe you. Nathaniel turned to the crowd, his voice strong and steady. You all know who I am. Look at the portraits on these walls. You've seen my face before. I am Jonathan Radcliffe's son, and I've come to take back what she stole. Emma took a step forward, her voice trembling but clear. He's telling the truth. Carla's been manipulating all of us, me, him, my father. This wedding was never about love or family. It was about keeping the truth buried. Carla's eyes flicked between them, desperation seeping into her gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the doors at the back of the ballroom flew open, and two men in suits stepped inside. They moved swiftly, heading straight for Carla. Carla Radcliffe, one of the men said, pulling out a badge. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Jonathan Radcliffe. The room erupted into chaos as guests leapt to their feet, gasping and whispering in disbelief. Carla stumbled back, her face pale, her hands trembling. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The men moved toward her, securing her wrists in handcuffs. You can't do this. Carla shrieked, her voice cracking. He's lying. This is all a setup. But it was too late. The truth had come to light, and no amount of lies could undo it now. As the officers led Carla out of the room, Nathaniel felt a weight lift off his chest. The anger, the fear, the confusion, all of it faded, replaced by a sense of clarity and purpose. He turned to Emma, her eyes shining with both relief and shock. Are you okay? He asked softly. She nodded, though her voice was thick with emotion. I didn't know. I had no idea. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low. I should have told you everything sooner. She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. No. We're in this together now. The sun was low in the sky when the black SUV pulled up to the gates of the Radcliffe mansion. Inside, the two officers exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening with the knowledge of the task ahead. They'd been preparing for this moment since the arrest warrant was issued earlier that morning. Carla Radcliffe was no ordinary target, her influence had woven deep into the veins of high society, and taking her down would send shockwaves through the city. As they approached the grand entrance, they were met by hushed whispers from the mansion staff, all of whom had grown increasingly tense over the past few days. The news of the wedding disruption had spread, but no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The lead officer, Detective Carter, knocked sharply on the front door, the sound echoing in the vast hall inside. A moment later, the door swung open to reveal Carla's personal assistant, her eyes wide with barely concealed anxiety. Can I help you? She asked, her voice trembling as she took in the badges. We're here for Carla Radcliffe, Carter said, his voice steady and formal. We have a warrant for her arrest. The assistant's face paled, her gaze darting toward the grand staircase where Carla's footsteps could already be heard. With the cool composure that had always served her well, Carla appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in a sleek, tailored suit, as if she had just stepped out of a boardroom rather than onto the brink of a scandal. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of the officers, but she didn't falter. Not yet. This is a misunderstanding, she said coolly as she descended the staircase, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. I'm sure whatever this is about, we can handle it with my attorney. But Carter wasn't swayed. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched with the warrant. Carla Radcliffe, you're under arrest for the embezzlement of the Radcliffe family fortune, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the murder of Jonathan Radcliffe. Carla froze mid-step, the color draining from her face. For the first time in years, real fear flickered in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a cold smile. "This is absurd," she said, but her voice lacked its usual strength. "These are baseless accusations." Behind her, the staff exchanged glances, the tension in the air thick enough to cut through. Carla's reign had always been one of control and manipulation, and now, watching her on the verge of collapse, a strange sense of justice filled the room. "We have sufficient evidence to proceed with the charges," Carter continued, unflinching. "We'll go over everything in detail once we're at the station. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Carla stood there for a long moment, as if she was weighing her options. But she had no options left. She had played her hand, and now the game was over. Slowly, she turned around, her hands shaking as she raised them to comply. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked into place, and in that instant, her entire empire began to crumble. Everything she had built, everything she had stolen, was slipping through her fingers. As Carla was led out of the mansion, Emma and her father, Robert, appeared in the doorway, their presence adding another layer of finality to the moment. Robert's face was lined with disbelief, his shoulders slumped as if he were carrying the weight of a lifetime of misplaced trust. "How long?" he asked quietly, his voice thick with sorrow. "How long have you been lying to me?" Carla didn't answer. She couldn't. Her silence was more damning than anything she could have said. Robert shook his head, the betrayal cutting deeper than any wound. "You ruined us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You ruined our family." Carla's eyes flicked to him, a glimmer of something, regret, maybe, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and no amount of words could undo it. She was escorted down the steps, her head held high, but there was no hiding the tremor in her hands. The SUV doors closed with a heavy thud, and the vehicle drove away, leaving behind the shattered remains of what Carla had once controlled so effortlessly. Emma stood beside her father, her heart heavy but resolute. She had always known something was wrong with Carla, but even she hadn't fully grasped the extent of the deceit until now. Her father's shoulders sagged with the weight of the truth, and she reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm. "Dad," she said softly, her voice filled with both compassion and strength, "we'll get through this. Together." Robert turned to her, his eyes filled with regret. "I should have seen it. I should have known. All those years. I trusted her." Emma shook her head gently. "No one could have predicted this. She fooled all of us." Robert looked away, his jaw clenched. "I thought she loved me. I thought we were a family." Emma swallowed hard, feeling the sting of her father's words, but she knew they couldn't dwell on the past. "We are a family," she said firmly. "You, me, and we have Nathaniel now. We'll rebuild. We'll be stronger for it." At the mention of Nathaniel, no longer just Jake, but the man who had reclaimed his name and his past, Robert nodded slowly. He had been hesitant at first, struggling to reconcile the story with the young man who had appeared out of nowhere, but now he understood the depth of Carla's betrayal. And he knew that, like Emma, Nathaniel had suffered under Carla's lies. Later that evening, the news of Carla's arrest spread like wildfire. The headlines blared across every major newspaper and online outlet: "Carla Radcliffe arrested in connection with fraud and murder." The social elite, who had once courted her favor and sought her approval, now recoiled in horror at the scandal. Invitations to exclusive parties and charity events vanished, and former friends distanced themselves, fearing the fallout. The Radcliffe estate, once a symbol of power and influence, became a place of whispers and shame. But inside its walls, something else was happening. As Carla's empire crumbled, Emma and Nathaniel were laying the groundwork for something new. Together, they sifted through the remains of the Radcliffe fortune, determined to right the wrongs Carla had inflicted. Nathaniel had spent years without a home, without a family, and now, with Emma at his side, he was finally beginning to reclaim what had been taken from him. It wasn't just about the money. It was about rebuilding a life, a legacy that had been stolen. Robert, though devastated, stood by his daughter's side, his faith in her unwavering. And in Nathaniel, he saw a man who had survived against all odds, who had faced unimaginable loss and still come out fighting. As the days passed, the mansion became a place of healing, of new beginnings. And while the world outside buzzed with the scandal of Carla's downfall, inside, Emma, Nathaniel, and Robert were focused on what mattered most, rebuilding the family that had almost been destroyed. Nathaniel stood on the balcony of the Radcliffe mansion, the cool morning breeze tugging at the edges of his jacket as he looked out over the grounds. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the manicured gardens below. He took a deep breath, savoring the quiet, the peace that had been absent for so long. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind: Carla's arrest, the media frenzy, the weight of his newfound identity. It was a lot to process, but for the first time in years, Nathaniel felt something that had eluded him for so long: hope. Behind him, he heard the soft click of the door opening. Emma stepped out onto the balcony, still wrapped in the silk robe she'd worn after breakfast. She moved quietly, always giving him space to think, but never too far away. Nathaniel glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "Morning," he said, his voice low and warm. "Morning," she replied, leaning against the railing beside him. Her eyes followed his gaze out over the estate, taking in the view that had been her home for so many years, but was now something new, something shared between them. They had been through so much, more than either of them had expected when they were thrust into Carla's twisted game. But in the chaos, they had found each other. What had begun as a forced arrangement had turned into something real, something neither of them had anticipated. There was trust now, and a growing affection that neither had been ready to admit until recently. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" Emma asked, her voice quiet but steady. Nathaniel turned to her, studying the determined look on her face. "Yeah. We are." After everything, they had made the decision to stay married. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The bond that had formed between them, born out of shared struggle and a deep desire for justice, had turned into something more. It wasn't a typical love story, but it was theirs, and it felt right. They had spent long hours discussing what to do with the Radcliffe fortune. After years of living on the streets, Nathaniel couldn't just return to the life of wealth and privilege without doing something meaningful with it. And Emma, her heart had always been in helping those in need. Together, they had decided on a path forward, one that would honor both their values. The Radcliffe Foundation had been established just a week ago. Its mission was simple but powerful: to provide housing, education, and support for the homeless and marginalized communities. The foundation's work would focus not just on charity, but on empowerment, giving people the tools and opportunities to rebuild their lives, just as Nathaniel had done. "It's amazing how quickly it's all coming together," Emma said, her eyes bright with excitement. "The donations are already pouring in. I never thought we'd have this kind of support so early on." Nathaniel smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "People believe in what we're doing. They see the need, just like we do." Emma turned to face him fully, her expression softening. "It's not just about the need. They believe in you, Nathaniel. They believe in your story, what you've been through, how you've come back from it." He met her gaze, feeling the weight of her words. It was strange to think of himself as an inspiration. He had spent so many years feeling invisible, like his life didn't matter. But now, standing here with Emma, with their foundation gaining momentum, he realized that maybe his story did have the power to change things. "People like us don't usually get second chances," he said, his voice quiet. "I want to make sure that others don't have to fight as hard as I did just to survive." Emma nodded, her hand reaching out to rest on his arm. "And we will. Together." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. It was a new beginning for both of them, and the future, though uncertain, felt full of possibility. Later that day, they visited the site where their first housing project would be built. The area, once an abandoned lot on the outskirts of the city, would soon be transformed into a vibrant community center with apartments, job training programs, and childcare facilities. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for the following week, and the excitement around the project was palpable. As they walked the site, Nathaniel couldn't help but think about the people who would benefit from it. He saw the faces of the men and women he had known on the streets, their struggles, their pain, their resilience. This was for them. This was for the ones who had been forgotten, just like he had been. Emma slipped her hand into his as they surveyed the lot, her eyes scanning the blueprint laid out in front of them. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice filled with determination. Nathaniel nodded. "It's more than I ever thought possible." The work wasn't easy. Building something from the ground up never was. But they were in it together, and that made all the difference. As they walked through the site, Nathaniel could see the future in his mind, the buildings rising, the laughter of children playing, the sense of community growing stronger with each day. It was a far cry from where he had been not so long ago, huddled under a bridge, invisible to the world. But now, he wasn't invisible. He was Nathaniel Radcliffe, and he had a voice. And with Emma by his side, he intended to use it to make a difference. By the time they returned to the mansion that evening, the sky was painted in deep purples and blues, the stars just beginning to peek through. They stood together on the same balcony where the day had begun, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "We've come a long way," Emma said softly, her head resting against his shoulder. Nathaniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "And we've got a long way to go." She smiled, her eyes full of quiet determination. "I'm ready." They stood there for a while, wrapped in the warmth of their shared purpose. The challenges ahead didn't scare them. They had already faced the worst, and they had come out stronger. As the night deepened, Nathaniel glanced down at Emma, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "We're going to change the world, aren't we?" Emma looked up at him, her expression full of love and resolve. "One step at a time." And so they stood, united not just as a couple, but as leaders of a movement rooted in compassion, justice, and the belief that every life mattered. This was their new life. And it was only just beginning.